Once again, welcome to Southwestern Sydney PHN Symposium. As I said before, my name is Sharon Pedersen. I'm the MC for today. And when the invites were sent out, we had a huge and immediate response. So there's obviously a lot of interest in what's being launched today officially. And if we look around the room, there's still more people to join us today, but even looking at who we have here in the room today, there's great representation across all the stakeholder groups. We have a range of carers and consumers who are here today, and really you are the reason why we're here, so thank you so much for being here. We also have more than 40 organisations represented today, from service providers to New South Wales Health. We also have a large contingent from Southwestern Sydney LHD as well, so thank you so much for coming. Mark Allen, where is Mark? I spotted you before. Hi, Mark. Mark Allen is here representing the board of Southwestern Sydney PHN, and as we all know, without good governance we can really lose our way, so it's great to have the board represented here today as well. We also have our cousins from Western Sydney PHN. Where are you guys? Oh, fantastic. So thank you so much for coming today as well. We have special guests here today. We have Gretel Colleen, who will be joining us later in the day. We are particularly honoured to have Professor Ian Hickey here. Can I say this is our fourth attempt to have Ian here with us today, a very busy man in high demand. So what do they say? Never give up, never give up, never give up, never give up. So it's fantastic to have you here. We also have the team from Southwestern Sydney PHN, and you can easily spot them by their fluoro name tags, and somehow I've ended up with one as well, so I feel like I'm part of the team. They are an excellent team to work with, so if you have any questions today, they are the guys to go to. Now, I would imagine that some people have travelled quite a long way to be here today. Who reckons they've travelled the furthest to be here? Any hands up? Well, okay, so we're shy as well as having travelled a long way. That's fine. Where have you come from? Adelaide. Well, Adelaide has to count. So can I just say, we are really, really appreciative of the fact that you've travelled so far. I knew there would be someone. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't get invited to too many symposiums. In fact, I wasn't even sure what the definition of a symposium was. So I looked it up and I found out that there's two definitions. And the first one is it's a drinking party, often with dancing, right? Now, admittedly, that goes back to the times of ancient Greece. So if we come up to the more current time, the definition of a symposium, and I quote, is a meeting of great minds with brilliant speakers and presentations. And that's exactly what we've got planned for you today. And they're presentations on new services that have been informed by you, going right back to the co-design sessions earlier in the year, then to the commissioning of the services only a few months later, and really after only weeks of operation, we're already starting to see some very positive feedback from stakeholders and consumers. I'm going to give you three really short examples. If you look at Headspace Head First, they've already exceeded the targets that were set for referrals, with more than 115 young people accessing that service so far, so that is a brilliant result. With the You in Mind service, which is for underserviced groups in the area, they've only been going for 8 weeks and already the feedback has been incredibly positive, with people finding it really helpful to have just single sessions where they can meet with a clinician very, very quickly at their time of being most vulnerable and without any expectation, and they can have all of their questions answered about that service. And of course it overcomes a huge barrier, which is that of travel. So it's actually meeting them where they need the service. So that's an outstanding result, and there's been an article in the local newspaper about it recently. And then finally, to quote a member of our Experience Matters committee, the quote is, "The PHN has honestly set the bar for the standard of lived experience involvement within health organisations," and I think that is very, very affirming. So it is working and the word is getting out there, which really links to the purpose of today. Because if you think about the purpose, you were invited to something which was the official launch of these services, but really today is also about us all understanding what these new services offer, because we all have a role in connecting people to them early. That's really what these services are about. So what are we going to cover? Well, we've got a great mix of keynote speakers and presentations on the newly available services, and we're going to be closing later today with a panel discussion hosted by Gretel Colleen, and that's an opportunity for all your questions about these services to be answered. So that's basically the guts of today. How is it going to work? Well, We have a lot to cover and a lot of us here, which is a great challenge to have. But timing is going to be really critical. So I'm just going to ask that we all keep an eye on the time, particularly if we can come back from breaks absolutely bang on schedule. And that way we've got a pretty good chance of keeping, to plan and covering everything we need to. Now, it is likely that you're going to have a lot of questions, and we're asking you to park them until the panel discussion this afternoon via the Ask It basket. So we have 3 of them. Do you love that term, Ask It basket? So we've got one at the back of the room, we've got one at the registration desk, and we've got one in the fill-up room as well, and that's a place for you to put any questions that you would like to have answered. And we'd love to see those questions in there by lunch this afternoon. So what else? Just a few little things. Housekeeping, the bathrooms are just out this door and to the right. The exits, you can see, are marked, and if we have to evacuate, very unlikely, then we're going to follow the instructions of the people that work here. There are scheduled breaks, as I mentioned, but we also have tea and coffee available throughout the day at the back of the room. I've mentioned the South Western Sydney PHN team. If you need any help, just look for the yellow tags. And the extra special news is that we are having today videoed, including the concurrent sessions. So if you really struggle to choose which session to go to, you don't have to worry about it, because in a few weeks they're going to be made available. And that's also extra good news for people who really wanted to be here that couldn't make it. And of course that includes our GPs who find it really hard to get away for daytime meetings. So let's get started. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the day, Keith McDonald. Now, Keith has been in recent months acting in the role of CEO for South Western Sydney PHN, and as of last week, Keith was officially appointed to this role. So huge congratulations. I think that deserves a round of applause. Now, Keith has had a really long involvement in health. In fact, his entire career pretty much has been devoted to it, and he's worked in a wide range of roles and locations with lots of years in management roles. I think what's really interesting about Keith is he joined South Western Sydney PHN even before it existed. In other words, he joined when it was South Western Sydney Medicare Local and remained with it when it transformed in 2015. Now, Keith is going to be setting the scene for today, focusing on the PHN strategy that underpins the new services, which are designed to specifically meet the key challenges in South Western Sydney. So please join me in welcoming Keith McDonald.
Thank you, Sharon. Thanks for the kind words. I'm actually really just the warm-up act for Professor Hickey. Welcome to everyone on behalf of the South West Sydney Primary Health Network for today. And I'd like to echo Sharon in thanking Josh for his acknowledgement of country, very heartfelt, and for the choir. And of course, particularly want to acknowledge all our speakers today who've put in the effort of coming to the symposium. Today's symposium is an opportunity to showcase what our PHN's response is to the Commonwealth's significant mental health reforms. And in particular, we're focused today on how we're addressing a more flexible and responsive step-cared approach across the spectrum of mental health needs, and supporting linkages with general practice to meet the needs of specific groups who may otherwise be unable to access services through better access. So what you'll see highlighted across a range of presentations on today's agenda are projects around which you've commissioned, according to evidence base, matched to local needs, capacity building for service providers, and integration of strategies with our key partners, which I'll flag in a second. In our planning over the last couple of years, we've heard from many local people with lived experience, their carers, and a range of providers, and they've told us a range of things. The stigma of mental health and mental illness remains a significant barrier to seeking help, particularly within specific cultural groups, refugees, which are a large needs group in South West Sydney, and of course our Aboriginal communities. Access to reliable information remains inadequate, particularly in languages other than English. But there's a high prevalence of problems with disconnection from family and community. Financial issues plus drug and alcohol misuse are significant triggers. After hours, there are few alternative options to a crisis other than attending an ED, and waiting lists for publicly funded services are long, with affordable psychiatry services few and far between. Response times and the coordination of care between services need to improve. Postvention response and support for families dealing with a family member who is suicidal or has taken their own life are inadequate. So the challenges we face in this region cannot be underestimated. Many in this audience already know, and can tell me, that in any one year in South West Sydney, approximately 1 in 9 people over the age of 15 will have an anxiety disorder. Approximately 1 in 5 will have a common mental health disorder. Approximately 4 in every 1,000 have a significant psychotic disorder. There is good news, but I'm just frank. Compared with the rest of New South Wales and South West Sydney, we are hospitalised more often for mental health conditions. We'll report much higher levels of psychological distress, most notably with our high school students. Our youth are more likely to be intentionally self-harm, particularly in Campbelltown, Wallandilly and Windsor-Carriby local government areas. And our children are substantially higher risk of developing clinically significant behavioural problems associated with a much higher prevalence of disadvantaged families in our region. So, of course, the PHN strategies cannot address all these strategies standalone. Our activities need to complement and integrate with the current work of key providers in this sector, including GPs, the local health district and their mental health services, regional non-government organisations, peak bodies, and here today including Headspace and Beyond Blue. So in this vein, I encourage everyone to make best use of the day through active dialogue and participation. If we're truly going to make a positive difference for our communities in this sector, it will take a sustained collective effort with shared commitment from all key players. So enjoy the day, and we look forward to catching up with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. So, our next speaker, where do I begin to introduce him? In many ways, he really needs no introduction, or I could give an introduction that would take us right up to lunch. And of course, I'm talking about psychiatrist Professor Ian Hickey AM. Now, Ian is very much the public voice for mental health issues in Australia, and his influence just isn't within Australia. He's also a very internationally renowned researcher in clinical psychiatry. I'm sure many of us will know that Ian was the founding director of Headspace, the inaugural CEO of Beyond Blue, and in 2003 he founded the Brain and Mind Research Institute, now known as the Brain and Mind Centre, and he continues in his role there as co-director. In so many ways, Ian has just had so many different roles and so many accolades, so I'm going to keep it short and really cut to today. He's giving me the thumbs up. Of direct relevance to today, Ian is a commissioner with the National Mental Health Commission, which recommended the mental health reforms which aim at shifting that focus from crisis and acute care to exactly where our newly available services are pitched, which is community-based services, primary health care, and that prevention and early intervention, which is so important. Ian is going to talk about these reforms, and particularly in the area of youth mental health services. Please join me in welcoming Ian Hickey.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the very kind introduction, Sharon. It is a pleasure to be here. I hadn't quite realised it was the 4th attempt to have me here. I'm not that an infrequent visitor to southwestern Sydney, as in fact the Brain and Mind Centre was associated with the establishment of the first Headspace Centre here in 2007. That was actually one of the first in the country. But I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands. It was just so fabulous to hear the introduction of those national anthems. I think, hasn't the country changed? When I went to school, you know, it was a big thing to stop singing God Save the Queen and actually sing Advance Australia Fair. To have moved on in that particular way just demonstrates hopefully where we've been, hopefully where we'll go in terms of learning from our Indigenous cultures. You may not notice a particular tie on here that's given to me by Arnie Joy Smith, who's an Indigenous woman in central Sydney. She has a number of very funny stories. One is, as far as she's concerned, we're all boat people. The second is actually, until we learn some of the traditional understandings, in fact, from Indigenous Australia, we'll fail to make the change we need to make. And in fact, that is not more true than anywhere else than in mental health. So a lot of the work that I'm associated with the National Mental Health Commission, really it's the perspective of Indigenous peoples about social and emotional well-being in communities, rather than a focus on mental illness, which is at the heart of our work. And a lot of what I want to talk about in terms of where we're at with regional service development in Australia, and I must say both anxious and excited about the shift from national central control to regional services as the only way forward, is about the social and emotional well-being of the communities in which we live, and whether we actually respond in productive ways to the communities we face. And that is so true of southwestern Sydney for a variety of reasons that have already been signalled. It's a very diverse community. And it's a rapidly changing community. I was saying I know how to get to Campbelltown, but every time I get here I get lost because of the development since last time I was here, as the community itself rapidly changes, as the population changes, as the sets of needs change. So what I want to talk about for the next half an hour or so is kind of what is the background to this, what's the overall goal of what we're trying to achieve, and then how is it that you as a community may actually go ahead and lead in this particular set of developments. Just like actually the Headspace here in 2007 was one of the first to open in the country, and we produced data from that Headspace, which still the national office has never produced data anything like the data that's actually come out from Campbelltown actually during those particular periods. Another issue I'll return to, which is one, this is a time of great change, but we also need to evaluate that change. We need to see where that change actually works. And the measure of that will be, does it work for your community? Not does it work in theory, not does it work in general, but does it work for your community? That's what regional service development, hopefully, is all about. It's a really good thing, so. Now, the most important thing here is to have the overall concept of what are we trying to achieve? We're actually trying to achieve social and emotional well-being. To turn it into current economic language, that's the mental wealth of our nations. Not just the mental health, but the wealth, that our prosperity, our social and economic prosperity, is actually dependent on actually what's in our heads more than ever. Not so much about mining and other sorts of things that we've done a lot of, but actually do we grow the mental and emotional capacity of our community in terms of the jobs, in terms of our economic prosperity, and in terms of our social cohesion for the future. Are we smart in our heads and able to respond? And you may not be able to see, but there's a little 5-word sentence at the bottom of that, which is a big science report done by the UK government back in 2008, that the key to that is actually early intervention. We're still working on prevention and how to do that well at a community level, but the one thing we do know is if you don't intervene early at any stage of life, that doesn't mean just in childhood, at any stage of life with the onset of problems, then you will do badly. Now, in the rest of health, that is just taken for granted. In the cancer area, in the heart disease area, in other areas, if you wait too late, you just won't get a great outcome. And particularly in terms of the impact on a person's life, the disability it results, if you don't intervene early, you'll miss the boat. Unfortunately, the whole of mental health services and much of our community response, due to stigma, due to attitudes, just due to the way the health system's designed, those issues about being more hospitalised here than anywhere, in a community that should be least hospitalised, you're most hospitalised, is an indicator of late intervention in those particular sets of injuries. If you want to make a difference, you've got to intervene early. And you've got to do that right across the lifespan. So this is a favourite chart of economists. The thing on the left there going up and down on the y-axis is mental capital. If you want to actually have capital, you turn brain power into dollars and productivity, you have to invest. Seeing those marvellous primary school children, you have to invest from -9 months, for those who've got teenage kids, right up to about 22 years. It's a really long social investment to grow mental capacity, emotional, social capacity to function. And then you've got to maintain it the rest of your life. Forget retirement, it's never going to happen for those in the room currently. Keep working, keep being part of the Campbelltown community. Never go to the Gold Coast, never retire and move, okay? Small warning here. Oh, thank you. There are more antidepressants prescribed on the Gold Coast than anywhere else in Australia. People go there to get depressed and die. Do not leave your community, okay? It's a marvellous place. Stay here. Be an active member all your life. To enjoy that mental capacity right across life. That's what we're about. And that's a whole community investment, certainly a family investment, productivity. I don't know if you saw the picture of the Prime Minister holding his grandchild over the weekend while having a beer. You know, actually, this is something we invest in generationally and generationally. The reason I mentioned the Prime Minister is that he's currently our biggest advocate of this mental wealth notion. And I'll come to show you, it's his direct intervention in 2015 that led to the investment we're now making in the regional sets of services. Because it matters economically, because it matters socially, because it matters transgenerationally. In fact, to change many of the patterns of disadvantage that we've had in the past. And those, of course, those issues are particularly relevant here in southwestern Sydney. So you've got to understand what it costs in disability. These are years of life lived with disability. You know, health changed from the 19th and 20th century. In the 19th and early 20th century, we were preoccupied with premature death from infection, from heart disease, etc. Now it's really years of life lived with disability. Many of us will live long lives. But what happens is the peak of disability is twofold. There's a twin peaks in the current preoccupation amongst ageing populations with dementia. It's kind of an interesting one, because actually most of us are living longer and more productive lives actually without dementia. something that may or may not catch up with us for those who live into our 80s and 90s. That, and I'm pretty glad about this, as I get into this particular age range, it keeps moving that way, is that actually, because of better lived lives, for those of us at least in the middle of the population, we live longer and more productive lives in our heads as well as in the rest of our bodies. The really big social challenge is in young people. So overwhelmingly, 60% of disability and not going to school, not going to work, not succeeding in young people is due to mental health and substance abuse. It's the big issue. Some of it with its onset in childhood, but a lot of it with its onset in adolescence. That's where the early intervention for those groups needs to be to return socially and economically. So in much of our focus, when we think about services that are not provided, that are relevant to the emotionality and the functioning of our communities, we've got to be thinking children, young people and ageing. Now everyone thinks a lot about ageing. Seriously thinking about children and young people remains a major challenge in this area. We've never set up services in education, in welfare and in other areas. The reason I also mentioned the Prime Minister, he's very much associated with the transformation of early childhood care to early childhood education as we change the funding models. It's our big opportunity to put right some of the disadvantage. In fact, some of the most fabulous examples I've seen in Alice Springs in Central Australia led by Indigenous people about school readiness. You know, if you don't actually make changes, if you wait till kids are 5 or 6 who are on a pathway of disadvantage, you've waited too long in terms of their lifetime sets of opportunities. Similarly, in the youth area, if you let young teenagers go astray and the patterns of self-harm that I just alluded to in the introduction, at that point, you will miss out for a lifetime. You know, so you've got to be thinking about where and when, and it's not what hospitals do, it's what communities do through their health, through their education, through their community sets of activities. So the peak age of onset of most of these problems in young men and young women is actually in the adolescent period. And young boys in particular have many boyhood development problems that contribute to that over a lifetime kind of period. So this for us is the real challenge. Don't worry what we call it. Don't worry whether we call it anxiety or depression or psychosis or substance abuse. It's really all part of the same emotional peak after the adolescent period. That's where we have to be, at least from the mental health bit, to capture that bit, no matter what the childhood risk factors were when it goes wrong at that particular period. Because historically, we haven't been there. So if you look at service use by age and sex, from figures from 1997 and 2007, I'll show the 2015 figures, we've only ever been there for 1 in 3 young women and 1 in 6 young men. So for those who had a problem, the health system hasn't been there to help. The education system's there to some degree, but not sure what to do and who to partner with often to actually maintain that. And after the age of 18 or 17, 18, nobody's there. It becomes a big gap that families and everyone else falls off after that particular period. So the service patterns there have never really changed, and this remains one of the ongoing challenges. So in our 215 sort of survey of these sets of issues, you see exactly the same rates of disorder in under 11 and over 12. But more importantly, I want to say those disorders actually matter. So days absence from school and patterns of self-harm. So a lot of the stuff in this area still remains a peculiar kind of social attitude, which is, you know, is it just a bunch of attention-seeking teenagers? Are they just going through a difficult period? Does it not really matter? You know, someone on the weekend asked me, does it really matter, you know, that my daughter said she wanted to kill herself? Does it really matter? I'm thinking, does it really matter? I'm having a quiet panic attack on the inside, trying to remain calm. Yes, I think it really probably does matter. And probably you should. I think, you know, if a daughter had been run over in the street, she wouldn't be standing there going, do you think it matters? You know, kind of, or had some other major kind of thing, do you think it matters? You know, you'd be going, yeah, get help, where to go? But of course, this is actually an educated person who understands the kind of system. It's not obvious often where you go for help. It's not obvious the extent to which it matters. It should be in all of our heads that if you want to be at school or you don't want your kids to self-harm, yes, it does matter. Just to explore it. You don't have to know the answer yourself. You just have to know where to go, who's there to help, and when you go to those people, are they really there to help? Or do you get the same kind of thing from them, sort of don't worry? Now, a lot of the areas and traditional responses in this area, because of a lack of services but also attitudinally, has been, don't worry. Let's see if she does it again. You know, don't worry until it's stuck for a few periods. One of the problems about much of our primary care type services are based on the fact that if the person presents once, we'll see what happens, so-called the sort of watchful waiting kind of thing. We'll see if it happens again. That's probably important. If it happens a third time, you know, we'll probably do something. That just doesn't work in the adolescent area. It works with middle-aged people like myself and others, you know, sometimes. Even there I sort of debate whether it really works for mental health problems. Actually, it doesn't work for teenagers at all. You don't get many goes at it. Not many presentations for service. When people do come, we've got to be really serious, we're there to help. So in 2014, as part of the National Commission I'm part of, when there was a change, if you can remember all the elections we had in Australia, you can remember all the Prime Ministers we've had, when we went from that, previous Labor government, and I must say Julia Gillard was particularly important in setting up the National Commission. She said, look, this really matters. We need a longer term perspective. The reports annually to the government, are we making continuous progress? We don't meet any of those reports, Ian, you've personally been associated with, human rights reports, Senate inquiries, Auditor Generals, everybody else saying it's a shambles. We need some continuing set of reports. So she set up the commission in 2012. When there's a change of government in late 2013, Alan Fells, who's the chairman of the commission, a very important man because of his economic perspective and also his experience of being a father with a daughter with schizophrenia, said we need a new economic model. We need to do this differently, just doing it the way it was worked. Now, at that stage, Prime Minister Abbott and Minister Dutton said, look, we don't need another review. We don't need another productivity commission review, which had just happened for ageing, because ageing is another example where aged care services need to be really different to stay in your home, not go into institutions. You need to fund them differently. But the National Commission can do a report. So, okay, we spent the whole of 2014 doing this report and delivered it to government on time in November 2014. I just want to run through some of the key issues. Basically saying the mental health system needs to change. It's got to be about the person in the middle and the family in the middle. It can't be about what you do. It's got to be about who needs the service, the users of the service, the lived experience. Fundamentally, health remains one of those things where we top-down plan for you, we don't co-create with you, and we certainly don't see you as the centre of those services in a particular way. There's a particular painting I have in my office, courtesy of my time Beyond Blue, or a replica of a Beyond Blue painting, which is from the Indigenous communities in Arnhem Land, which has a person and their family at the centre. And everybody else sits around in education, in health and whatever. And in fact, it has a person and their family and then the community and then the services sitting around. And the question is, are they useful? And if they're not useful, get out of here. Be replaced by somebody else who is useful in that particular kind of setting. And I think it's that sort of concentric approach is a reminder to us all, who's really at the centre of all of this. To achieve that, you need a new system architecture, and the new system architecture we're going for is regional purchasing and regional delivery. The whole federation debate in Australia is a completely sterile one about states and territories and who does what, and as out-of-pockets grow and disadvantage grows. Australia is a complicated place. It used to be in Simon Crean's office, when he was the Minister for Regional Development, there was a map of about the 55 sensible regions in Australia by geography and economics, of which southwestern Sydney was one. Now, sadly, they actually corresponded with the Medicare local maps at the time, but change of government, we can't keep that. So we chucked that out and came back with the 31 or so PHNs we now have, which in some parts of the country map and others don't. But the concept is the right one. Really different places in Australia need different responses. You don't need it planned from Canberra or from Macquarie Street. You need it organised locally. You need to be held accountable locally. That means what was the Medicare locals need to get out of providing services, replace them with a PHN who purchase services. They can then sit there and decide, hopefully on the basis of data, is it good or not? And guess what? They can hire people from elsewhere. What's here is no good. Get somebody else in to do the job. Don't necessarily be bound by what is local, but it must work locally. So that's what the system architecture is about, and we'll come back to that in some detail. And basically a shift in service funding from hospitals, particularly in terms of Commonwealth dollars, from hospitals to communities on an ongoing basis. Of course, strongly resisted by many in the professions. I'm most disappointed when this came out that my own profession, the College of Psychiatrists, said, oh, I don't know about this, this will just result in money going away from hospital beds. Got to keep the hospitals open first. A very traditional response to those sets of issues. And I would not underrate the response of the traditional professions and services to system reform. System reform means something's got to change. It doesn't mean just lumping stuff on top of everything else that was there before. It doesn't tend to work. So, it's a time of flux, a time of challenge, a time of change to make this actually work. First thing to say to the Commonwealth as well was there's a lot of money in the system. The Commonwealth alone spends over $10 billion, but it spends $6 billion of that a year on welfare services or support services for late intervention. Right? Once you've already lost your job, lost your home, require income support, then we help you. Not before. So we only spend $4 billion at the Commonwealth level actually on services. We spend $6 billion on welfare and support. Nationally, depending on your count, we spend about $25 billion chucking state services. Same thing. We spend even more at the state level on hospitals and services and emergency care. So you can see the whole system is shifted towards basically spending most of your money in acute services and hospital-based services on a smaller population in higher need. So we talked about reshaping the expenditure curve. Got to do something over the long term. Now, we were not talking about pulling money away. We were talking about investment of new money. All we said at the time was, about 2% of new money, could it go into the community for the future? Right. At the time, the Minister, Susan Lee, was on her way to a COAG conference and said, no, can't do it. It remains the ongoing challenge, and I'll come back to this in terms of Prime Minister Turnbull. New money. The Commonwealth commitment is to put new money actually into the community, into systems that work, or into trialling systems to see whether they work on an ongoing basis. So the priorities for new or reinvestment are absolutely not the hospitals, not more into carer support, but actually into the bit in the middle. Recovery-focused services, child and adolescent services, psychosocial support, hence the importance of the NDIS, the other big change that's going on at the moment in relation to the NDIS. Although the NDIS itself is fundamentally a late intervention system. You have to have established and persistent disability to get in. Now, we should all, that's fine, but we have to be a little bit careful here. $20+ billion are going to go into that. In the mental health area, several billion, but it's going to go into late intervention psychosocial support. It's not early intervention money. Bit of a debate about how that goes ahead. And primary mental health care. Now, that doesn't mean GPs alone, it means in the community, primary mental health care. And it doesn't mean non-specialised care, I might say as well. It should be better referred to really as ambulatory care. It should be referred to as community care, not just primary care. Mental health is not a simple business. Many of the issues that we deal with require the cooperation of a range of different professionals and specialisation to get a good outcome. We don't say to people with cancer, we don't say to people with complex heart disease, you just need a simple primary care service. Sometimes you need a lot more than that. You need the right care at the right time. And I come back to this issue of step care. I much prefer the terminology myself, stage care. Depending on the stage of illness, you get the right care at the right time. You don't have to go through a whole lot of steps before you get the care you needed the first time. And traditionally, are there any English people in the room? Good. I hate the NHS. Can I just say that? I hate the NHS because it's led to this worldwide sort of thing. You must go through your GP first for everything, and then you go to the next bit, and then you go to the next bit. What about if you needed the right bit up the front? It's very interesting in the NHS when they looked at their cancer outcomes compared to the rest of Europe, they were worse. And was there a delay in presentation of care because you forced people through too many filters when they had something much worse in the first place? If you've got something much worse in the first place, you need to get it. If you don't, and you can cope with other sets of things, fine. But actually matching the right level of need to the right level of intervention is the key also to early intervention, not delayed care. Some models of step care are actually delayed care. And you have to be really careful that you don't introduce more barriers to effective care. You don't get many goes with young people. You don't get many goes with disadvantaged people. Many Indigenous people are extremely reluctant to come forward with services. Many people don't speak English. You don't get 6 goes at it and going through a whole lot of services if what you needed in the first place was more specialised care. So it's a bit of an issue, as you can see. I've got a bit of an issue with the way the Commonwealth's rolling out step care in a simplistic primary care, and I blame the English, organised, structural, top-down, Darwinist model of care. That's the NHS, okay? And everyone thinks it's great. They think it's fabulous. I have some German friends who've arrived recently who go, what is it in Australia? Your healthcare is chaotic. I go, yeah, we prefer it that way. It creates opportunities, but it creates challenges. No, it's not very well organised, and that's our problem. But actually making it better, we can be not so rigid, and this is our opportunity through this regionalisation. So, we're very lucky for us in mental health that actually Prime Minister's changed because Prime Minister Turnbull already had a big interest in this mental wealth concept through his previous interests and in technology. So basically just at the end of 2015 and prior to the 2016 election, the Commonwealth actually made a big commitment. Now, the PHNs had just been formed, as you know. They were looking for a big bucket of money to tip into the PHN, so there wouldn't be just a little thing. Anyone in for a big bucket of money? We in mental health going, yep, we're in. We want to be part of the healthcare system. We want reform. We have about $350 million plus going into various separate programs in mental health funded by the Commonwealth, not very well coordinated with each other, and each run by a central agency, whether that's Headspace or Beyond Blue. They tend to be national agencies sitting with national money in a particular way, not necessarily well coordinated at the regional level. Big bucket of money. So the Commonwealth, in terms of establishing PHNs, also then established this big transfer. Now, many people in the mental health sector don't like it, needless to say. If you've been running one of those programs, and there were many good programs, including things like the Partners in Recovery here in south-western Sydney and others, which are affected by these changes. So reform always, potentially creates winners and losers and shifts in services. But the Commonwealth's prepared to say, and people in the mental health sector say, let's be in it. You know, it has all the other models we've tried haven't worked. Let's be in one that's regional, that's purchasing, that's community focused, and on this particular trip. Let's stay with the rest of medical care. Let's put in significant money. We need, and as you saw in the election by both sides, by the opposition and by the current government, real prioritising suicide prevention at a community level and recognition that it's different. Suicide rates are not uniform. They are different in south-western Sydney. They're different in the Indigenous peoples in south-western Sydney. They're different in regional and rural Australia. In addition to the economic and educational factors driving those suicide rates, also are access to care. It was World Suicide Prevention Day yesterday. It matters what you do in your community, but it also matters whether you have access to care in a crisis. And if you do have access to care, you have lower eventual suicide rates. If you have poor access to care, you have higher suicide rates. So while suicide prevention is a big community issue, it's also a big health service issue. We're lucky with the Prime Minister, I'm personally associated with this, is using technology to much greater degree to engage people. Now, I don't want to upset all the GPs and everybody else in the room, but, you know, the clinic of your future's in your pocket. You know, the more you know, the more you bring in, and we are now doing this with technology, you can say what your needs are before you get to the service, and then say to the services, can you help with my needs? Rather than going to a service who says, this is what we do, and do you fit our inclusion or exclusion criteria, we'll help you or we won't help you within our particular sets of issues. So you see this based on the NDIS philosophy and others, shifting to the needs of the person. Technology allows you to document those needs. We're doing this with our own headspace services in central and eastern Sydney. Trials of responding to people's needs rather than telling them simply what we will do. Pretty challenging. But also specialisation, the issue being access to specialisation being much greater through the use of technology. The other thing the Prime Minister it was a fascinating meeting recently with the Prime Minister and the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, where a whole lot of services were advocating for what we need is more money. Now, we probably do need more money, but give us more money. And he said, weren't we going to do trials? Weren't we actually going to work out what worked regionally and invest in them? And a lot of service providers, just give us more money. I'm quite attracted to that trial idea. We don't know, frankly. And we don't know whether what works in south-western Sydney is the same as what works in Geelong and Corangamite on the coast down there, or it works southern Sunshine Coast in North Queensland. We don't really know. We need to be in the business of saying, OK, this looks like the best construction, this is really responsible to the PHN, to work out for this population what we do and then see whether we do it, actually, to trial. And if it works, great, up goes the investment. If it doesn't, we do different. Or say to the service providers in the room, if the service providers don't do the job, sack them, get some more, get others, put people on notice that actually we're not going to pour more stuff. I've been one of those people saying, don't give us new money for old systems. Pouring good new money into dysfunctional old systems is not the way to go. But as we develop new systems, they have to be willing to be evaluated seriously as to whether they have impact. And if you do that, the Prime Minister made it clear in 2015, on an ongoing basis, new monies will go in. And now the new, it's relatively new, Health Minister Greg Hunt, whose mother had a severe illness, has made it really clear he's really interested in mental health. He keeps going out and saying mental health and medical research, these are his priorities. And all the doctors in the hospitals are going, what? Going, yeah, these are the things we need to do. Mental health, research, because research matters, meaning evaluation of the health system itself, as well as new treatments and new discoveries. But these are priority areas because they're priorities at the communities level. And he's seen through family experience the real importance of that. So where are we at? You know, now we're in this very anxious period, and those who have been involved with PHNs will be aware that there's been a bit of a pushback from the mental health sector, new overarching committee between Mental Health Australia and the PHNs and the commissions to, make sure the PHNs don't waste the money or go off and do something really, completely off-reservation type thing that might be quite dangerous. A lot of angst out there. But, the real issue is, can you build the capacity in your community to respond to your community's needs? Well, you need to know what your community's needs are. You need to know beyond the demography, the sort of figures that Keith was just quoting about hospitalisation, where the figures are, what matters, which communities within your communities, how are they accessing services, what's going on, and document that. So the PHNs, with very little support, I must say, have a terribly large job to work this out and continue over time. Now, a lot of people want them to have it right now. The whole thing's been going 1 year. That's a little unfair. So I'm on the group that says, hang on a sec, it's going to take a while. But as long as they play ball, and playing ball is acting on behalf of the community, not necessarily acting on behalf of local service providers, but acting on behalf of the community. Sure, a lot of the local service providers may know the community best, but they need to have the capability, they need to work with others, they need to build. There may be the issue of bringing in service providers from elsewhere. I gave a talk in Northern Sydney recently, which I loved, because they've purchased a service from Western Sydney. Can you imagine the people on the North Shore finding out a better service existed in Western Sydney, run by Uniting Care, and importing it? Shock, horror in the room. I said, that's excellent. Mind you, if the Western Sydney group don't do it, sack them next year. If they don't do the job, get rid of them, get somebody else. But the idea of getting in other people who can, or working with national programs, be that Headspace or others, to get the capability is important to bring into the communities. And that's possible under the purchasing models. The second one's probably the biggest challenge, or my challenge to you. Are you really serious about partnerships, pathways to care, acting on behalf of the people in the community? Are you more serious about keeping your own service open and functional? Because everyone can divide up a little bit of the community and say, I service those 10 people, or those 100 people, or those 20 people who have this particular need. And you end up with a sort of jigsaw puzzle with 90% of the pieces missing, but everyone arguing they do their own particular role. But actually, is it smart? Is it well coordinated? Now, historically, because of our systems of government, we don't. We just fund more services. So we have a shower tap kind of effect. We just pour money in the top end, nobody gets wet down the end, But everyone says they're doing what they're doing in a particular way. It's a really big challenge. And the issue in many communities is what's the right number of services alongside what is the right degree of coordination. There's a very important principle in healthcare known as the Arizona principle, which is, in Arizona, there are very few services, but they're very well coordinated. Everyone knows everybody. So they don't actually compete, they actually work with each other. You put in more services, the tendency is to compete more and so have less coordination. To say, I'm Headspace, I do young people best, or I'm a particular provider to a cold community, I do that best and nobody else does it. That's not true. It's actually how well coordinated for those populations, a youth population, a cold population, whatever, the Indigenous population, how is that actually coordinated? And what are the range of different services? And in fact, you often need many services if you are focused on the needs. What are the needs of that person? If a young person is from an Indigenous community, has a concurrent alcohol problem, has also a social welfare difficulties, how do you coordinate the sets of services that that young person needs? Not simply say, oh, well, there's 16 services and we each do a little bit of something, but no one really helps. Who's really engaged? So the coordination, the real issue, and this is really where the big drive for regionalisations come from. Not only is it smart by communities, but nationally run programs are hopeless at regional coordination. They have national cookie cutter models. They say this is what you'll do, this is the shop front you'll open, you'll do this kind of service, you'll provide this many sessions of something, and then your financing contract will run that way, and there'll be almost no accountability for its impact on the population. Is it what was needed? There's a certain community I'm associated with, Western New South Wales, didn't want a Headspace because they didn't want another Commonwealth agency dropped into their main street on top of all the other Commonwealth agencies, when they're trying to sort out youth services in that area. And you can see the kind of, not that there wasn't a need for more youth services or better youth services, but just dropping another agency in isn't always the solution to the problem. Now, PHN's got to sit there with a blue, UN blue beret on, trying to keep peace, okay? Hopefully they're doing it with people who lived the experience, hopefully the governance of the situation, and hopefully the seriousness of the service providers is how well do you do it in partnership. So that partnership with those experiences is important. You've got to be prepared down the line to stop some stuff. I was going to say that again. You've got to be prepared down the line to stop some things. There is only a fixed bucket of money. Not everyone does it equally well. We have to be prepared in mental health to move on from things we did less well to things we can now do better. That's got to mean shifting the funding in order to get new funding and trialling. That's a really hard thing to say in a sector that traditionally is not overfunded in any sense in these particular things. But we've got to be able to look at what does it better and invest more of our time and money in what does it better. Tough gig for the PHN in the longer term. But that's essentially what's happened to part of the mental health sector. And so all the mental health agencies that are upset, they're upset because money's shifting. Now, I think the issue is in the reformulation of how we work regionally, what gets funded. Then what to prioritise. So very much from the community point of view, the PHN and the whole movement here is to prioritise early intervention for greater social and emotional and economic outcome, okay? We have to intervene earlier, so the youth services areas has to be important. It's got to have a focus on continuing ambulatory care. We can't be in people's lives for 10 minutes and expect a good outcome. It's just not going to happen. So this work I'm associated with at the moment, following young people over more than 5 years, what we see in those particular services is about a third of people deteriorate functionally. okay? We think we're doing great, and about a third stay the same, and only about a third improve, actually, functionally. So we are not there yet. You can create headspace or other early access points. That doesn't necessarily in itself deliver the functional outcome. You've got to be there on an ongoing basis. So how to make sure for the kids most at risk, we stick with them. Now for us, this is a staging issue. Get the kids who are already struggling in school and employment and education, those who are not part of the functional community, they're the ones we have to go after hard and stick with in multidisciplinary ways, not just a little psychological care, not just a little health care, but partnerships with education and employment to actually make sure we get functional recovery, often supported by housing and family support, other functions, the continuing care issue. And for those who've got illnesses, recovery. There has to be this continuing emphasis on recovery. Now, part of that comes through the NDIS support, but part of it's got to come through the health system and not be based on hospitals. It's got to be based on ambulatory care. Some of the areas that have not gone ahead yet are actually some of the severe and complex funding models. So we were talking about cashing out Medicare payments in a number of these areas. Hasn't happened yet. New purchasing models. Buy it differently if you want to get it differently. Big issue with the Commonwealth. Early days. But looking for PHNs to take a leadership role. So just to give you an idea of what I think you should be focusing on in terms of outcomes. So my final point is really, before I get chucked off, it doesn't matter what we do, it matters what the outcome of what we do is. Health is a terrible place, and again I blame the English for this, about activity-based funding. You know, you fund the activity. And we in Australia are even worse under the MBS system. We only fund little activities done by doctors and other individual people. In mental health and substance abuse, to get good outcomes, you need complex interdisciplinary care over time. That is a well-established fact. So what do? We fund the opposite. We fund individuals to operate on their own, and we fund activity, not outcomes. Okay, so you know, we fund the primary care activity, we fund the second activity. What do we say we have? And all the data I'm associated with looking at Australian Institute of Health and Wealth and everything else, everyone sends their activity data. We go, we don't want your activity data. Did it do any good? They go, what do you mean by that? What do you mean, did it do any good? Okay, well, first of all, did the kids stay in employment, education, functioning? There's a really big OECD issue here. It's called the proportion of your population between 18 and 25 who are not in employment, education or training, NEETs. It's a big economic predictor for societies on an ongoing basis. So the first thing is, were the kids in function, and when they left our service, were they in function or out of function? In those key age-appropriate functions. That's the big economic outcome. The second one we care about is the kids aren't coming to harm. I could, you know, physically assault a number of my epidemiological colleagues who go, oh, look, don't matter. Look, by the time they grow out of it, half of them grow out of it. Go. That's if they're alive. You can imagine saying to kids with asthma or kids with injury, look, you'll grow out of it later on if you're still here. And if you haven't done yourself too much harm or you're not too disabled by it in the meantime. You know, panic, families, schools, others are entitled to panic in the face of life-threatening and serious self-harm. It's a very high community priority, and so it should be. Increasingly, we're aware of the extent to which mental health drives substance abuse. And one of my favourite people in the world, Kathleen Merrikangas from the National Institutes of Health, she pointed out 30 years ago, that if we dealt with anxiety and depression in early adolescence, we'd prevent about half of the drug and alcohol problems we have. Right? Simple secondary prevention issue. If you deal with the drug and alcohol problems early, you prevent a whole lot of secondary mental health issues. There's a simple sequence. We've got to do both, not run separate services or not even mention the drug and alcohol side of things for young people. We're increasingly aware of the extent to which people have poor physical health outcomes, and last of all, we're trying to prevent the progression of illness. But the outcome that matters, just record the functional outcome. You record one thing. Just know where they were when they started with you and where they've gone over time. To do that, we've got to do two things. One, forget the stuff about diagnoses and everything else. It's about trajectories and stages of illness. Treating the kids as individuals, where are they at, what stage of illness they're at. If they're already 15 and got a well-developed psychotic disorder, for God's sake, don't send them to a primary care service that can't help. You know, if they actually don't need a whole lot of psychological care but can be dealt with online or other services, use them in an appropriate sets of ways. So the personalisation and the staging of illness is a big issue. And then really what we're going to do is do it at scale. No, we'll stop at this point. The scale bit is designated services like Headspace, but it's also the online services. And just to say about the online services, I'll skip over this particular bit, is we now have technologies. So the other thing the Prime Minister's backing, and the thing I'm associated with personally called Project Synergy, is the use of technology. You can get more young people in, you can manage more services, you can arrange service in an appropriate way. So technology is going to be a major aid to us in the future, particularly with young people in terms of planning and delivering services. But it's only an aid. The real issue is in this room. Are you seriously organised to work together collect the data and demonstrate that regionalisation is a better option than our previous forms of doing mental health care. Thanks.